Hi, this is Kara from the Special Needs Mom podcast.
And this is Angela from Especially Organized, Sensible Solutions for Special Needs Moms.
We have this heart for special needs moms. And so we thought, you know what, let's combine forces. And we have come up with what we're calling the Purge Party. And you can pretty much guess what it is. It's a party where we're going to come together and we're going to purge, or in general, accomplish a goal, a small goal together. So we have set this for January 27th, starting at 8 o'clock for my Pacific Coast people.
Which means 11 o'clock for all of you on the East Coast. So this is an opportunity. If you have something on your to-do list that has just been stuck there and you are wanting to move it up on the list, you're wanting to tackle, maybe it's a space or an area of your home or a category in your home that has just needed a little time and attention. This is your opportunity for you to be online with us while you work and have access for us to help you answer your questions, help guide you, and just serve you for those 2 hours.
Yeah, exactly. And I think you can tell like what we've designed is just this very high level of support for that project that you just haven't been able to tackle on your own. The thing that we are envisioning is that you get to leave this purge party feeling so accomplished because you did the thing. You started the year off getting that thing done that you were stuck on last year. And so it's a momentum builder, if you will. You can go ahead and sign up. We have a link ready for you. And we are offering this for $40 for the whole experience.
Absolutely. And we hope you'll join us. I think it's going to be really fun. It's going to be a great group of moms of special needs kids. So we all get each other. We all have an understanding of what it's like to have something on our to-do list, but just we haven't been able to tackle it yet. So I hope that you will join us. We're super excited to bring this to you, and we are thrilled to work with you.
All right. We'll see you all there. Hi, I'm Kara, life coach, wife, and mom to 4 incredible and unique children. It wasn't all that long ago that my son received a diagnosis that had my world come crashing down. I lacked the ability to see past the circumstances, which felt impossible, and the dreams I once had for my life and family felt destroyed. Fast forward past many years of surviving and not at all thriving, and you'll see a mom who trusts that she can handle anything that comes her way and has access to the power and confidence that once felt so lacking. I created the Special Needs Mom podcast to create connection and community with moms who find themselves feeling trapped and with no one who really understands. My intention is to spark the flare of possibility in your own life and rekindle your ability to dream. This isn't a podcast about your special needs child. This is a podcast about you. If you are a mom who feels anxious, alone, or stuck, then you are in the right place. Welcome. Hello, and welcome back to the Special Needs Mom podcast. I'm really excited for this guest today. Quite honestly, it was a conversation I didn't want to have, but I also wanted to have. It was one of those. Daniel approached me with the conversation that we had today as an idea. He pitched it for the podcast. And as you know, normally I don't have dads on the Special Needs Mom podcast. However, this was an obvious exception. And so I'd like to tell you a little bit about Daniel before we get into the episode. And so Daniel's son, at the age of 12 months, was diagnosed with the rare disease called Menkes syndrome. After adjusting his expectations of what raising a child might look like, Daniel began to tell Lucas's story with a short documentary. That film led to Daniel co-founding Disorder, the Rare Disease Film Festival, and then later the Disorder Channel. Both are dedicated to spreading awareness for patient families facing any one of the more than 7,000 rare diseases. One of Daniel's stories about Lucas won the 2015 Rare Story Patient Award from Global Genes. His award-winning 12-minute documentary on Menkes syndrome is narrated by Oscar nominee Mary McDonnell. And in 2008, he founded the Ballston Spa Film Festival. He was a pioneer of original content online, now called web series, and co-wrote and co-produced the internet's first animated series. I want to know which one that is. He's created videos and marketing materials for American cinematographer, PBS, Right Rice, biotechs, hospitals, most major TV studios, TNT's The Closer, and HBO's Curb Your Enthusiasm, among others. Now, it's clear to know that Daniel's a boss when it comes to making films. And so he currently works as the Global Genes Association Director of Community Engagement. As you listen to this episode about Daniel, not all of you will have diagnoses that clearly indicate a shorter life. However, the conversation that Daniel and I have, I think, applies to all of us as we process the original diagnosis and the impact that has on all of our lives. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce Daniel DeFabio. Well, welcome, Daniel, to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for making the exception based on gender. I get to be a special needs dad, not special needs mom, but I'm flattered to be included.
Yeah, actually, the joke that you and I discussed over email, I wanted to mention that. So this is the Special Needs Mom podcast and men named Daniel. So now we've had, because for those of you that are coming back here, you'll know that my husband came on as the first male guest earlier this year, and his name is Daniel. And so I thought it was kind of funny that both of the exceptions to the show are named Daniel. So I am so glad that we made the exception. Thanks for reaching out. And when you proposed the first topic that you proposed, it hit me so clear. And it was my whole body pinged. And it was the kind of experience where I was like, oh, we have to talk about that. And I don't want to, in the sense that it's not, for me. Yeah. I don't think it's an easy conversation to have. I'm still in process, obviously, as a lot of special needs moms are. Most of us, this is our first time doing it. And thank you for proposing it. And thank you for being willing to come and have this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And just hearing you say how it is scary reminded me of how it is scary. And I think that, we all want to live in hope. We all want to live in optimism, but we don't want that to be ignorance of reality, right? Hope with no regard for reality is kind of foolish.
Yeah, that actually reminds me of the time recently here as I was preparing for my son's surgery. I really had a hard time figuring out where to land as far as, I feel like I was kind of on this wide pendulum swing where I'd swing all the way to like, this is not a big deal at all. It's all okay, to, oh my gosh, this is really, really hard. And I was really kind of, and I think I probably shared it in the episode last week, or that came out last week, that I really kind of was judging like where I was. I wasn't ever in the right spot. I could tell that through the lens of judgment. It didn't work very well. So yes, we're here to talk about it openly. And so thank you for proposing it.
Yeah, I heard you say something like that in that episode, that it was only in putting it out there and letting your friends tell you what their reaction was that you could figure out if your reaction was, normal or acceptable. And I've been there too. I'll throw something out on social media and think, there's no big deal. I might not even need to mention it. And then people come back with, that's a lot. That's big. That's heavy. I hope you're okay. And then all of a sudden it crashes down on you like, oh my God, I'm going through something big. Because it's something else you had said, we get used to this stuff. We think, oh, I've done it before. This happens all the time. We're in the hospital every other month. What's the big deal? Well, yeah, some of them are big deals.
Yeah, right. So our survival strategy is to kind of normalize it for us. Like, oh, it's not a big deal. I got this. And I mean, way in earlier episodes, I talked about how I was actually kind of cocky about like when we would go get our MRIs at the hospital. Levi has to be sedated. So it's like it's almost like a little surgery, even though he's not being scalpeled. And I was like, oh, I got this. I've been here before. You don't have to tell me all these things. And it was really actually kind of funny to look back. And it was a couple years ago that it just hit me, boom, like the emotion came in to supersede that cover of I got this, to like just the being in that place has you kind of reconcile the why. Like, why are you here? Oh, it's because your child has XYZ. So Yes. So let's get into the questions I have for you. Today, we're really going to dive in quick. And I know special needs moms, we can handle this. And so I want to dive right in. If you would just give us a picture of your son, Lucas, of what his life was like, and kind of just a quick snapshot of how you would describe your life with him, I would love to hear that.
Sure. Lucas had a rare disease called Menkes syndrome. And despite it or because of it, he was the happiest kid I've ever seen. Most of us, whatever percentage of our days are happy, smiley, laughy times, his was at least 80% of the time like that. So that's the good news. He had a great life. We lost him about a year and a half ago. But Menkes is terrible. It meant that he couldn't walk, he couldn't talk, he couldn't maintain a position without assistance. He was tube fed. Towards the end, he needed oxygen. So there were tons of challenges there. And like anyone who's a special needs parent, it changes everything, puts you on this different path, and some good things come of it. You meet some amazing people that have gone through something similar to what you have, and some of them become my best friends now. You definitely rethink the world. And, again, maybe you're open to new and better things in a way, better mindsets in a way. I hate to say I'm a better person because of it. I would like to think I was going to become a better person no matter what. But, I am. I'm doing better things because I had a son like Lucas.
Mm-hmm. Likewise. Yeah. And knowing, when you got his diagnosis, it was made very clear to you that there'd be a high probability that he wouldn't have a long life. And so you had this knowledge to grapple with. How did that, if at all, change the way that you parented him and the way that you chose to care for him during his life?
It's very hard to digest a prognosis. In Lucas's case, it was 3 to 10 years he would live, or typically boys live. It's almost always boys. Turns out he beat the odds. He lived to 11 and a half. So that, that on the one hand felt amazing. On the other hand, it felt like that last year and a half was extra scary. That was the borrowed time. That was really pushing our luck here. I think anybody who's gone through a scary diagnosis, there's one mindset that you just have to digest it. You have to get over the scare and the trauma and all that. And then you figure out what is your new normal or your ever-changing normal going to be. And being mindful of a short life, it's hard to do. It changes probably everything. A lot of the sort of well-worn phrases we've heard, words of wisdom, like stay in the moment, live for today, no one's guaranteed tomorrow. All of a sudden that stuff is really true. It's not just good advice. It's your gut level existence, and you realize why these are well-worn phrases, because, there's wisdom to it. And I don't mean that we instantly became Zen masters, his mom and I, always, see the bigger picture, but it did take away some typical social expectations. Like, well, we're not going to do that because we're dealing with this crisis level lifestyle, and we're not going to, coach the soccer team. Well, also my son's not playing soccer, but and then, in my generous modes, I'd look at all the therapies we'd have to go to or the medical appointments we'd have to go to. And I think everybody's got their something, and other people have a busy schedule with basketball and ballet lessons. I'm like, well, yeah, but don't be too generous here, because you can blow off basketball and you can blow off ballet. I can't really blow off these medical appointments. So there was a lot of adjusting, and probably all of this is somewhat universal for any special needs mom out there. Where it gets a little different with a short lifespan being your prognosis, sometimes on a practical level for medical treatments, they'd say, if he were going to live longer, we'd do this. And that will really rock your mind, because your gut is to say, treat him just like anybody else. Let's do what you do for anyone that's going to live a long life. And then I hope we had enough wisdom to be accepting of the difference that made. So, for example, there was one instance where a lot of people were recommending he needs hip and spine surgery if he's ever going to walk. Meanwhile, other members of the medical team were like, he's never going to walk. So why put him through that surgery? And it was one of the toughest choices we ever made, because until you're in the special needs space, we all have this way of treating doctors. That is, they know best. We're going to listen. What they say is what we're going to do. And then you get into this weirder space where maybe they don't, or maybe it doesn't apply to my kid, or maybe there's only bad choices out there and there's no real good choice. So one of your previous guests, the woman who lived in a remote part of Maine, calls it choose your hard. These are all bad choices. These are all hard choices. And which one can we live with best? And so in that case of Lucas's possible hip and spine surgery, we're like, the discomfort for recovery for months being in that brace for this kid and having to lift him, into every position he's going to be in, now in somewhat of a, cast around his hips, it's crazy. And the risk of any surgery and any recovery, that always has to be factored in, right? But then on the other side of the equation, what difference did it make that he was in a shorter lifespan? We figured out a little too late. One of our doctors on the team kind of felt bad about it. He's like, we've been shying away from x-ray because, everybody has like a lifetime exposure to x-ray.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Well, if your lifetime is 70 years, you have to be sparing with x-ray. If your lifetime is going to be 12 years, you can probably go for a lot more x-rays in 12 years than you would, So those were the practical medical considerations that are a little different because of his lack of longevity. But then there's all the emotional stuff and guilt too. I mean, every parent probably gets guilt, but if you're not doing everything you can for your kid today or this week, you kind of think, well, maybe I'll get it next week. Maybe we'll spend more time together later. And then you think the time is short. Shouldn't I be doing it now? And I'm sure you've had lots of conversations about how the caregiver needs their time, the expressions like put your own mask on first. But even before COVID, I was a work at home person, and there'd be a nurse downstairs with Lucas and I'd be upstairs not spending time with Lucas. And that would blow my mind sometimes. Like, how is what I'm doing here and now more important than what I could be doing downstairs with him, given that I don't have very much time with him? And especially roll into that, I was doing some volunteer stuff for rare disease communities. This is stuff I do in his name for his benefit. And I think, isn't it more to his benefit to be down there playing with him and making him laugh than it is for me to be, sending another email of outreach? Yeah.
Well, the answer is maybe. Nobody knows. And it really, as you're kind of processing these kind of scenarios, it really makes it clear for me that these are the hard questions we grapple with as special needs moms, and in your case, dad. And I don't know that there's not a right or wrong answer. And I want to make sure we put this in the space, because I think this is a scenario where it's easy to go to an automatic of be like, I have to spend all my time with Lucas because he has a short amount of time. Like let's call that the obvious answer. But it doesn't mean it's the right answer. And I think you obviously, as you navigated this, maybe you would do a couple things different, maybe you wouldn't. But ultimately, at the time, you were doing the very best you can. So obviously we have to, recognize that at any moment, all of us are doing the very best we can with what we have, with what we have to give and what, just where we're at. So what other kind of emotional impact did you notice? Does Lucas have any siblings? Or did
he has a brother who's 2 years younger. So at the time Lucas died, Alex was 9 and Alex is now almost 11. And I just today asked Alex, some of his thoughts on having a special needs brother. And he's like, I never think of him as special needs. He's just my brother. And sure enough, he didn't have any other sibling experience, right? So what's the difference that he could compare it to? But it's kind of refreshing. And I think you've probably seen that sort of meme that goes around, like, how do you know how to treat a special needs kid?
Yes.
Look at what their siblings do, right?
I love that
one. It just
one.
comes naturally to the siblings. They just figure it out.
I'm laughing because I'm thinking about the ways that my kids are to Levi. And, I don't know if it's a model,
Yeah.
but it certainly it is different than a lot of people treat him, which I do think is good as far as it does not have the lens of pity. So it is an interesting perspective from his sibling, recognizing that was his normal. And, of course, there is an emotional impact of losing your brother at a young age. And I'm sure as a parent, parenting a child that's lost his brother is also a very unique situation. Any other emotional impacts that kind of come to your mind when you think about kind of what it took to be in the game wholly during the time that you were parenting him and as you transitioned from his passing and beyond?
Well, to that second point, after his passing, it's been, it's certainly not easy, but it's been unusual that, it's like we're in a club, we're in the special needs parent club.
Mm-hmm.
And that part of my identity is different. I'm, I guess, now in the former special needs parent club, not the current. And so as I mentioned, some of my best friends came out of this shared experience and they're still in the throes of it. And I'm steps removed from it and getting a little bit more removed from it as time passes. And so now it's almost a different cohort that are my best peers, my best confidants. It's the special needs parents who have also lost their child. And they are the ones now that have the advice I need and the shared experience that I can relate to. And it's almost like a rug being pulled out from you again, right? The first one was, I'm going to be a parent to a typical child. No, you're not. And then, okay, I've changed my life. I've become a parent to a special needs child, and I've learned some of the ways to get through that. And then that's gone. And now I'm a bereaved parent to a former special needs parent. So just when you think you're getting good at something, I guess,
Yeah. Well, the word that comes to my mind is reinvention. So it's like, I would wholeheartedly agree that it's like this club. And I would say that you're at the elite level now. You've gone further than in the sense of the emotional impact of what you've had to watch in your son's life and death than a lot of us have. And so I feel like you are uniquely positioned to be able to kind of be a light and to help all of us in the club, in the bigger club of special needs parenting.
Yeah, I guess there's some value in having experienced from beginning to end. I mean, it's certainly not all inclusive. Everybody has their different parts of the journey, but there's a similarity from the beginning to the end too. I think everybody has probably learned, whether they wanted to or not, that you're grieving a diagnosis in a similar way that we've thought of grieving a death. So if anyone's not familiar with that, it's tough to give yourself that permission. That why do you grieve something that's not a death? Because it's like a death of your expectations. Effie Parks is another podcaster that she calls it the fictional child you thought you were going to have before your child was even born.
Yeah,
so that fiction dies and we grieve it, whether we know it or not. So then, of course, at the end of life, the end of my son's life, now I've got the typical grieving, the grieving of loss to go through. So in some ways, the first can help prepare you a little bit. It takes, what I had to learn is that the grief is triggered not by a death, but by a shock event. And the shock event can be the diagnosis. And then knowing we would lose Lucas and having years to have that hang over us, I don't mean that it made it easier, but it did make it less shocking. I think the grief, rather than happening on the day he died and lasting from then on, we were pre-grieving for years.
Yeah, I can imagine so. And yeah, I mean, I very much relate to the grief of the life that you once thought would be and is not, right? And that it's regardless of death or life. So through this journey, obviously you've had to accept the diagnosis, the lifestyle, and obviously his death. And Acceptance is something that a lot of us special needs moms struggle with, right? Where it's like we think that if we accept something, then it means something. Like a lot of moms I work with, if I accept that my child will need care for the rest of their life, then it means the rest of my life will be something other than I want it to be. Like I'll be tied down or restricted for the rest of my life. So therefore, the idea of acceptance becomes something we actually don't even want. And yet, many guests on the show, myself included, have talked about the gift of acceptance. And so I'd love to hear your journey with acceptance. What are your thoughts about it? Where you feel like you were at a high level of acceptance and where you might have been at a low level of acceptance.
I think to the extent that we might have done it well or good enough is when we took our cues from Lucas. Obviously, even a typical health kid, might not want to work, the equivalent of therapies, right? Like physical therapy, like OT or something. So I don't mean to just say that let's spare him all the hard stuff, but we did balance, for example, that being accepting of he's never going to walk. I know other people in other situations will be like, well, the hell with that. I'm going to make sure I'm going to do my damnedest, and every therapist available and the sun is going to come and we're going to get this to happen. And good for you. If that's a possibility and that's something you're going to fight for and make happen, bravo. For us, we chose not to fight that. We took that for what it was. I don't know that it was 100% medically impossible for him to walk. Maybe we could have been those super achiever parents, but in our situation, like the trade-off here, he's not going to get a greater, in our opinion, so much greater quality of life as to be worth all these extraordinary measures. So that was one type of acceptance. As he got bigger, after the age of 2, we couldn't really travel on airplanes with him. So we had a different kind of life. We had the life where you don't travel as much. You travel where you can in the van with the wheelchair. And that's a smaller radius of travel for us. And, we didn't particularly want it to be that way, but we learned to accept it and change things around to be what was possible for us. I think I said elsewhere, like one of the keys to being happy in these situations is to be happy with less happiness, which just sounds, it's such a bummer of a message, right? But it is, I think, all about, you and I talked about calibrating or changing your expectations. Any gratitude practice, for example, are you going to be happy with what you have, or are you going to be unhappy with what you don't have, right? We really had to level set and like, what's a good day? A good day is when Lucas is happy and smiling. And let's just keep it that simple, and there were times we were fortunate enough that when he was little, we got him to go to places like Disney World, and actually they're not so good for him. The hot weather wasn't good for him. Big costume characters weren't good for him. They scared him. Long lines, not a great idea, things like that. But it did leave me with, we never got around to doing, there's sort of a bucket list you keep in mind, especially when you think the timeline is short. And we never got around to doing a Make-A-Wish. And you think, of all people, severe special needs family, we should probably do a special thing like a Make-A-Wish. But because he couldn't communicate to us, we didn't know what his wish would be. We'd just be imposing a wish on him. And that just seemed a little arbitrary. Does he want to swim with dolphins? Maybe he would. I don't know. But instead, what he did want, which was so easy to give, and yet requires a change of perspective. He wanted his people, his family, his nurse, his close-knit group around him as much as possible. Just sitting on the couch, not doing anything special, just being next to him. So it's a big shift of what you thought would be necessary, needed, best, and taking your cue from your kid can put you on a different path.
Yeah, I love that you clearly were, I love your example. Does he want to swim with dolphins? I don't know. But taking your cue from your child and then accepting that as it is. I mean, clearly what you wanted was different, right? Like out of the gate. But being willing to accept what was right for Lucas allowed you to be in that space and likely have more peace and calm and kind of security, knowing like, hey, we're doing the right thing for Lucas and ultimately for you guys. I want to go back to this concept you just mentioned about being happy with less happiness, because I like the way that it sounds like, oh, but I genuinely, prior to becoming a special needs mom, and even afterwards, as I was kind of processing, okay, how do we now get out of survival and actually think about like, what would it look like to thrive now? I genuinely thought that life should be 90% happiness and good. And then we'll sprinkle in like 10%. Yeah. Right. So that's the lens at which I thought was kind of like how it's supposed to be. And I've learned over the years, and one of the mentor coaches that I've worked with talks about like 50-50. If we look at all the spectrum of emotion, we're going to be on that spectrum at some point, and half of it is what we would call like unpleasant or maybe even negative emotions, and then the other half is on the positive side, or the side that we would say is more desirable. And I was like, oh, and it's still, I'm like, I don't know. Like maybe we could just at 75-25. Like, come on, let's edge it up a little bit. If you look back at your life, regardless of if it was inclusive of your special needs child, that's kind of how life is, right? Like, really good things happened, and yet somebody you love just gets a diagnosis and all these kind of things. Like, that is life. And it took me a while to accept that is life. And it doesn't mean that something's wrong or that we are extraordinarily unlucky.
Yeah, there's one of the Irish poets, either Oscar Wilde or Yeats, said the supply of joy and sorrow in the world is constant. And so that goes right to your 50-50 breakdown, right? And again, I think in that sense, Lucas had it better than most of us, better than the rest of us. He was happy most of the time. And it sounds glib of me to say, what more could you want for your child? Because certainly I wanted him to not have pain, physical pain, not have the disabilities. I wanted all those things. But from his perspective, him being happy, we got that. He got to live that way. And it was more us, the family, thinking, this isn't right. This isn't the way it's supposed to be. This isn't what we thought things would be. Again, not meaning that his journey was easy, but it was predominantly happy for him. So
such an interesting, different dynamic to work with, and one that it sounds like constantly your mind was bumping up against. I want to switch gears a little bit. And for as much as your wife is willing for you to share and talk about her, so obviously through that lens, I would love to hear what you noticed about the differences on how you processed all of it, the diagnosis, the life, the passing of your son, as opposed to your wife. Obviously, because most of my listeners are moms, I want to kind of highlight how a male experience might be as opposed to female, knowing that they likely look very different.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I think sometimes we might land on gender role norms, and other times it might be more about introvert, extrovert. But we both, I think, responded with a need to act. But her actions were very much, how can I do things for Lucas? I can adapt this piece of equipment. I can make this thing that's not supposed to fold over like this. I can cut it and fix it and make it. And she was nicknamed Mom Guyver. And,
I love it. I love her already.
Yeah, I did some of that stuff, but I tended to turn outward. What research is out there that I can absorb and learn and find? Who can I connect with? Who can I, maybe I can get this person to talk to this person. And then that somewhat quickly turned into efforts that weren't just for Lucas, but were for all kids with Menkes disease. And then that turned into not just Menkes disease, but all rare diseases. So there was a very much to oversimplify it, my wife going inward just to our family, just to Lucas, and me going outward to what does the world need to know about Menkes disease, or who in the world can help us with Menkes disease, and those kind of things. So that was a pretty big difference in our approach. But then also, I'm sure a lot of families you talk to, there's just the ebbs and flows. When she was strong, luckily, that's when I was weak. And when I'd like to think the reverse is true. When she was weak, hopefully I was there ready to be strong. And thank goodness for that, because if you both collapse at the same time, you're in trouble. But yeah, it was different approaches that maybe two sides of the same coin.
Yes, well said. As far as a lot of us don't fall into the norms, right? Or, maybe where the large majority fall in. Everyone's going to have a different processing experience, obviously, given personality types.
I also think for me with the gender norm where it's often more the women that want to be socially engaged, want the support group. And my wife didn't. She went kind of solo, but I certainly did. I sought my people. I found my people. I brought them in. And sometimes she didn't want to hear about that. Like someone else's experience didn't seem to really matter to her because she was busy living her experience with it, And I don't say one is right and one is wrong, but I've been in the space enough to know that I'm usually bumping into moms, not dads. And I see in the films we do on rare disease, if you put a mom and a dad on camera, it's typical that the dad is reserved and maybe looking less comfortable talking about it. And the mom is valuing that conversation more, right?
Yeah, I don't know. I think I'm kind of intrigued in this topic, and it's not something I've actually even thought of or talked about a lot, but I don't know. It's intriguing to me to actually look at how personality type impacts the way we process and the way we then go act after we get a diagnosis. But let's move on from that conversation, because I want to talk about this kind of, I don't know what we would call it, but something I notice when I share with people that don't know me in some way or another that my son had a brain tumor, and in this case, brain tumors now. I notice that they're like, ooh, like they have a big reaction to that diagnosis. And honestly, I don't like sharing it because I'm like, ugh, like I don't like their big reaction. Like I don't like seeing them try to people respond in all different ways. Some people, just like we were talking, go inward. They want to know more. They're intrigued. And some people go outward. They're like, never mind, abort mission. We're not going to talk about that. So ultimately, I think people are uncomfortable with that diagnosis. And my guess is that when you share with people that don't know you yet, that your son had a rare disorder and died at a young age, that people get uncomfortable with that. And I'm wondering, now that you're in this experience, what you notice about how people respond. And then I more specifically want to know what does that then kind of lead you to think, and kind of what do you do in those scenarios?
Yeah, I think you're right. There is so much. Some people are better at it than others, but there's so much basically fear of our own mortality, right? So then you see in a child a disease state or diagnosis that either carries with it a short lifespan or just even implies it. Like, so brain tumors, scary for anybody, even more scary for a young child. And so some people are just plain scared away. They're not in the place where they can face it, and they don't want to talk about it. And they, in our case, and probably a lot of people's experience, you lose some friends because of that. They're not there for you. And then they really stop being there for you. But then the flip side of that is when you're vulnerable, when you're exposed, sometimes that's the only time other people are going to be that with you, right? So yes, I'm facing a very unique situation with this particular rare disease, but all of a sudden the person I'm talking to tells me about their mom with Alzheimer's. And they weren't going to share that before, but now we are. And now we're having a deep conversation, a meaningful one. And we really know each other at a level that we weren't going to when we were just talking about the weather or the soccer game or whatever. It's another version of everybody's got their something. But for some reason, our culture, I guess, is so biased to positivity that we're not going to lead with the bad news. And in some ways, because we're in this pandemic era, Lucas died in June of 2020. And so we've yet to experience the typical socialization of cocktail parties, let's say, right? So there haven't been that many social opportunities where we've had to introduce ourselves and somebody says, how many kids do you have? And my wife and I don't have a great answer right now. Just, do we lead with one and just leave it with that? Or we say we used to have two and now we have to explain, why do you not have one of your two? Because yes, the diagnosis kind of situation was enough of a taboo topic or an off-putting topic, but then child death is another one. It's somebody just asking you a chit chat question and all of a sudden they're in for a big long ride.
I know.
You're blindsiding them, and then there are times, how generous of spirit am I going to be in that given moment, or my wife is going to be, and am I more worried about sparing you, the person I just met, an awkward conversation, or am I emotionally drained and I don't have it in me to get into all this, and you're going to get my brush off answer instead. It's tough. It's so tricky that you can't warn anybody. You're like, hey, do you want a tough conversation right now? Because that's what you just opened up. So you have to gauge, am I ready for it? Is the other person ready for it? Is it worth having this conversation? Does it in some way dishonor my son's legacy if I gloss over it? Was he so unimportant that I'm going to go the next hour not talking about him?
You asked some really good questions that obviously are going to be part of your processing and kind of becoming a special needs dad whose child has passed, right? Like that's kind of the reinvention of like, how does it now look to go and be in the world? One of the questions that I always am super awkward about is, hey, how's it going? Out in the world, at the time, right when you're getting a diagnosis of, oh, your son has a brain tumor. It's hard to answer that question without feeling like a liar. Like to me, I don't know. I know that most people just say, I'm good, thanks for asking, and don't think more of it. But I have a hard time with that. I have a hard time with just kind of moving on. I actually want to do an episode on this, but I think that in conjunction with it, that question would be a really good one. Hey, how many kids do you have? Such an innocent question.
Yeah.
And I imagine it's a very hard question to answer once one of your children or multiple children have passed away.
Yeah. And I hope to get to maybe some kind of shorthand answer that does a decent job of it. Because when Lucas was alive, I think to the point you were just saying, like, if I were to just say, oh, we're good, it sounds disingenuous. If they know our situation pretty well, they're like, how can you be good? Don't you have a severely ill child? You don't mean that. You're just not answering my question. I had developed a shorthand where I'd say, well, if they ask specifically, how is Lucas? I would say, he's good. And what we mean by good is it's been 4 years with no emergency hospitalizations.
Right?
I
might borrow this from you.
Yeah, that's a mouthful, right? But at least it sets the tone at a very honest level. We can have a serious conversation if you want and know what my sort of baseline of what I feel is good enough in our life is. And you don't have to feel that bad for us because he's struggling. Clearly he's struggling, but he's not struggling as much as we fear he would be struggling. So that's our good, that's our level of good.
That's actually really helpful to me because, we're in a time of Levi's recovery. So everyone's asking, how's Levi? How's Levi? And I know they mean well by it. And I don't take any offense to them asking, but I hate answering that question. I'm like, how is Levi? Like, well, how would you be? And so it's hard to answer that. Either like, he's good, but I say he's good. I'm like, that just doesn't seem like it's covering it. There's more there. And so I think I'm going to do some work to kind of say, okay, what would my good? And good means.
Yeah.
Like, that's really, really, really good. So thank you for sharing that. So both when Lucas was alive and now in his passing, my guess is, and more especially, I guess, after his passing, my guess is that there's some questions that people ask you that feel really good. And there's some that maybe don't feel as good. And I would love just to hear, like, what feels really good when you're meeting, maybe it's a longtime friend, any person really, and they find out about Lucas's passing. What do you appreciate, I guess, how people meet you and what they do kind of come to you with genuine curiosity and connection?
Well, I think some of what's really great is learning a little bit more about his life that we didn't witness ourselves, right? Because he wasn't the kid that could come home from school and tell you about his day. And And we live in a small town and people knew us. And that was a blessing in a way because you didn't always have to explain what's the deal with Lucas's health because maybe everybody already knew or enough people knew, right? And we could bump into people on the street and it wasn't like, of course, they would talk to Lucas, but Lucas couldn't say, that's my friend from school, right? So they would have to talk to Lucas first, then talk to us and say, I know Lucas from school, or I know Lucas from this therapy or whatever. Now that he's gone, those kind of things can still happen. And somebody has this personal memory of Lucas and they share it with us. And it's this great gift, right? Mm-hmm. We never knew that piece. And there were moments from his school that were, we would say, maybe the teachers assessing him more optimistically than we did. And then looking back, we think, wow, maybe we should have given him a little more credit. Maybe he was doing more of the intentional communication than we thought. And so that's all the great stuff that happens, that he had an impact, and not just on us. That's the part we saw. We were there for that,
I actually just got to experience this as well. So Levi, as he was preparing for surgery, his school kind of really rallied around him and supported him. And we had a place where people could come post and leave encouraging notes. And it was beyond moving to see exactly what you said, the impact that I didn't get to see, the people that were truly touched and impacted by Levi in ways I would never have guessed. Because, of course, I'm his mom. I'm dealing with a lot of the challenges, and it's easy to kind of focus on what's not working, and maybe sometimes harder to connect with like what really is working and who he is out there in the world. Those will be treasured comments and really very, very helpful for me in recognizing that I was missing part of who he is out there. What about those questions that you field now that whether they just don't hit you right or you just personally don't like them? I'd love to hear if there's anything there for you.
I don't know if anybody has said anything wrong. I tried really hard to, well, let me say this. At the time, immediately after his death, the next few days, a lot of people would, whether they wrote a card or whatever, say, I don't know if I'm saying the right thing, or I hope I'm not saying the wrong thing, or this may come out wrong. And I have to say that nobody got it wrong. Every sentiment was a good sentiment. It didn't matter what they said. It was the fact that they were saying something. I really try to maintain that attitude because I know when he was alive, it was a minefield where you could say the wrong thing and trigger us and we'd be angry and, you don't understand our situation and you would never say that to us if you knew what we were going through. And that's just not healthy for anybody. So knowing how difficult it was to say something because there are so many wrong things that could be said. And we all have those fears just in our everyday life too. Like, oh, if I say the wrong thing, it gets interpreted the wrong way. So I really wanted to be as charitable and welcoming to anything you're saying about my son. I'm going to take as a really good effort, a way of you trying, right? And every once in a while, there might be a clunker of somebody's religious belief being different than my religious belief, and some of the baked in assumptions there that might not be comforting to me, but knowing what the intention is, right? And the intention is comfort. So I focus on that.
I think that's a brilliant, brilliant lens to look through, because the result is that you get to feel cared for and loved, and you get to have a clear and open relationship with that person who I love. You're like, a little funky there. I know it was said with love. Ultimately, it sounds like you experienced love and connection. And so I think it's a really, really good snapshot of what it looks like to look at any circumstance and have a relationship to it that results in the experience that you want. So it's a good snapshot. So thank you so much for sharing. And one more question before we wrap up here. I was thinking about what you do with the disorder channel. And clearly, you have gone outward and you've stepped into kind of being a role model and being a champion for parents that are in the experience at any point along the journey that you've been in. And I want to talk about a little bit about role models and if you had any at the early stages of your diagnosis and who maybe became your role models. I want to share quickly about one of mine because I think it illustrates that most of us have zero role models in this space that we can relate to as special needs parents when we become special needs parents. Therefore, when I had one role model, and her name is Beth, she runs an organization called Mitchell Thorpe Foundation. Her son, Mitchell, passed away when he was 15. She's gone on to create an organization around supporting parents and families like theirs, specifically in fundraising. So she and her husband, Brad, came to my house and were an example of what's possible after the thing that I thought in my mind was the most tragic thing that could ever happen is not just your son being diagnosed, but your son passing away. And therefore, I had at least one person that I knew that was living life beyond. And, she appeared to be happy and well, and clearly not the same person she was before Mitchell died, in the sense that, obviously that changes you and impacts you. But it gave me something to think, okay, this is possible. And so I want to hear from you where you started and kind of your journey as far as having and then ultimately becoming a role model.
Well, you're right. In this space, it can seem that there are so few role models to be found. They're hard to find. There's less of us or whatever. And in the beginning, it was certainly Jamie Eckman for me. She was the founder of the Menkes Foundation. And I was so lucky. Well, it's terrible to think you're lucky in rare disease world, but it's a different level of difficulty if there's not already an organization for your disease. And thanks to Jamie, there was. And there was a clinical trial for Menkes. And so a lot of those things that I know my friends in this space are working so hard to get to were already in place for us. And that was a major comfort. So I definitely count her as a role model. And then it wasn't kind of until I began to tell Lucas's story, and that led me to going to Global Genes. And Global Genes brings together all these perfect role models. And they're amazingly, high achieving people, and it can be intimidating. And you look at them and for me, I had no idea you could do so much to advance the care of this disease, right? Whatever disease concerns you. So there's people that are raising the funds and getting the research going and working towards cures. And just all of a sudden, these role models are there to say, you could do it like this, or you could do it like this, or you could do it like this. And that's when I met Bo Bigelow, and we had a lot in common. And really his approach, we kept landing on, that's something I do, or that's something I wish I was doing, or I want to do what you're doing and I want to do what you're doing. And that led us to collaborate and create the Rare Disease Film Festival, which then later became the Disorder Channel. And really it all grew out of, we saw the value of sharing our kids' stories to be the first step of many steps that would maybe improve the outcomes for these kids. And then each time we had to ask the question, well, yeah, I told the story this way, or I told it in this medium, I told it on a podcast, I told it on a blog, I told it in a film. What next can I do? That's how we got to things like, well, maybe there should be a film festival, and maybe there should be a channel, and maybe we should teach people how to make films, and maybe we should recruit people to make films. And so we've begun to do all those things. And then, circle of destiny or whatever, now I work at Global Genes, and I create those opportunities there that I first took advantage of in 2015.
Wow. I actually wasn't aware of that last piece. And it's pretty amazing and inspiring, right? I know sometimes some of the moms that are listening, you're not there yet, and it's totally okay. Yet allow this picture of, the snapshot of Daniel's life to be something like, okay, that's how he did it. And what from his story ignites you. And so as we kind of go into close, I'd love to hear a little bit more about the Disorder Channel, what you'd like to share about it. And also, please tell people where they can find more information should they want to connect with you and or the channel.
Yeah, thedisorderchannel.com. or the other one is rarediseasefilmfestival.com. We probably won't do a film festival until it's safe to gather people in person again. We did 2, Boston and San Francisco. And a lot of the films that were in the festival are on the channel, but the channel is growing beyond what we ever did at the festival because we sort of have infinite, we can add as many films as we want. And so now we have about 150 or more films and videos that are all rare disease patient stories. And maybe someday we'll cover all 7,000 rare diseases. But even if we don't have your particular rare disease, I think we've learned that there's enough sort of common experience that what the SMA parent is going through or the cystic fibrosis family is going through still feels pretty real to me and my experience with Menkes disease. So I think it's a valuable platform both to be contributing to if you have a story in film or video, or just to be receiving of, to find that kind of share expression of a shared experience, right? That maybe isn't, it's out there in certain things like your podcast, but it's not out there as much in film and television. So just sort of gathering that into one destination. If you have a Roku device or an Amazon Fire TV device, you just search for the Disorder channel the way you would search for adding HBO or Hulu or Netflix, and it's free and it comes up and you can watch as much as you want. When they're not always happy stories. We try to have some hope in the stories. So it's definitely something you go to when you're in the right space for it.
Well, I'm really glad you mentioned that last piece about being able to find it on Roku, because to me, I'm like, oh, that's easy. I can easily do that. And actually, I think my son's going to love this channel. He deeply connects to other stories. So Daniel, thank you so much. I'm so glad that we had this conversation, even though it asked both of our hearts to step into something that sometimes can feel a little scary. Is there anything that you would like to say or share as we wrap up this episode?
I think just touching back to that point of when you find rare disease or special needs role models, it can feel intimidating. Maybe they're far on their path and they're doing things that you think I could never do. I think there's a lot of ways to do it. And you play to your own strengths. I'm not going to be, I did stuff in film. Okay. So that's where I went, but I'm not a runner. So I didn't do 5Ks. I didn't do charity runs, and maybe you are, and that's your strength and you should play to that. Or the people that raise millions of dollars, I don't know quite how they do it, but if that's your strength, go with it, So I guess don't let any role model intimidate you or feel like that's the way it has to be. You can invent your own path through this. Some people are selling cookies. Some people are making adaptive fashions or adaptive medical gear equipment, and all that stuff is needed. And it doesn't always have to be the same as the person that seems to know what they're doing, right? Or has done it before.
Well said. And I want to add one last thought to that is that, and some of you moms might actually not be doing anything outward, but you might be becoming the mom that you want to be to live the experience that you want for your life and to be the mother of your special needs child. So I wanted to put that in there because it doesn't mean that you have to then go out and do something outward as a campaign or being advocate. But I think, again, using the inspiration and the ignition of, is that the right word? Ignition? Is that like to put on fire these thoughts? That's, I think, what we're getting to. So with that said, I'm going to wrap up the episode. And again, Daniel, thank you so much for bringing this conversation.
Thank you for having me. It's been great.
One more thing before we officially wrap up this show. Sometimes when I'm listening to podcasts, I have the experience of wanting more. I'm listening at the very end thinking, I sure wish that episode didn't end. I invite you, if you feel in any way the same way, I invite you to the Special Needs Mom podcast community, which is a free group that I host on Facebook, where we as a community of fellow moms who listen to this podcast and are experiencing life in similar shoes, get to talk to one another, get to share stories, get to actually interact. I hope you'll consider joining. See you over there.